Thanks very much indeed. I'm really pleased to be here to, number one, present some new work that we published in a paper form just last month, but actually perhaps more importantly from my point of view, to use the time at the end of this session to hear from you about your questions, but also hopefully your contributions on this area. We've called the paper "Taking the Burn Out of Heating for Low-Income Households," and by taking the burn out we mean two things. One, taking the physical burn, stopping burning fossil fuels in our heating, and the second thing we mean by that is taking the pain out, so taking the pain of unaffordable bills out of heating. I've started the slides with my contact details because, as I say, this is quite a new area, I think, in policy of practice this focus on heating, and I'll get to that focus on heating in a moment, but it's a relatively new area, so please do get in touch. This is by all means certainly not the last word, or certainly not all of the solutions that we need in this area. This is the paper that we released last month, and as I say, it's a culmination of actually quite a lot of thinking over a couple of years around, how do we enable households who are already struggling to afford adequate heating to shift to clean heating? And for me, this has been a big challenging question. When fossil fuels have been so cheap, when is it responsible for us to really start the drive to move away from those cheap fuels to cleaner fuels? And so, first of all, I'm going to talk about some of the context why the focus on heating and not deep building renovation, as we normally talk about, or on full decarbonisation. We talk more about heating, I think, in the last couple of years than I've ever heard in my last sort of 15 years working on buildings. So first I'm going to talk about why the focus on heating, and then I'm going to talk through the approaches we took to this work. First of all, a bit of an economic analysis of what are the economics of switching right now, and then through to some of the solutions and strategies I found for reducing the costs. So first, why focus on heating? Heating this decade is incredibly important, starting these huge structural shifts away from reliance on fossil fuels into cleaning up our heating. The first chart you'll see here on the left is from the IEA. Most of us, I think, are really familiar with this now, seeing between 2020 and 2030 really significant changes in the sources and the fuels of heating. The biggest notable shifts here are massive reductions in coal and oil between 2020 and 2030. That's the brown bit at the bottom, and huge increases in heat pumps. That's the big bluey turquoisey colour. Also increases in solar thermal and district heating. Another really key statistic that caught my eye is from the European Commission's impact assessment on achieving our 2030 climate target, which is a 55% reduction. And I should say what I'm about to describe isn't a European target, but it's an indicative sort of level of effort needed to reach that target, which is that around 1 in 4 homes will have to change their heating system in this decade. So clearly this decade now, actually, we're getting quite a long way into this decade, but this decade is really key for heating. In addition to those preset targets, we obviously now more recently are experiencing this huge fossil fuel price crisis, where we've seen the cost of wholesale gas rise tenfold in 2 years. The price of wholesale price of gas is incredibly volatile, as we've seen now. The other fossil fuels used for heating following with very significant price rises, not as significant as gas. And of course, with Russia's invasion of Ukraine, we're seeing the geopolitics of energy in the European region, demanding a huge reduction of gas use in Europe. And of course, remember that the residential sector is Europe's biggest single gas user. So this is another reason why this kind of huge focus, I think, on gas use in particular, but on heating as a result of that. And in response to both these targets and the need to move away from reliance, particularly on Russian gas, we are seeing a number of member states strengthen existing policies or introduce new policies to phase out the use of fossil fuels. In heating, and probably the most dominant type is the phase out, the use of a technology phase out, so phasing out the replacement of fossil fuel boilers. And clearly these policies rely on the natural replacement cycle, so the natural lifetime of the boiler, which really means when you start working back, given a boiler lifetime can be anywhere from about sort of 15 years, a bit longer for oil boilers, for example, working back from 2045 or 2050, you can see really actually these phase out policies, to be fully effective, need to be starting quite soon. And hence this is why these countries are introducing policies. In addition to that, the other policy response we're seeing is to start ending these subsidies for fossil fuel heating technologies. And there's a really nice, cool little interactive chart here from the Cool Products campaign, who've recently done a study on national subsidies for fossil fuel and other clean heating. In addition to that, we're seeing within the Fit for 55 proposals, two key directives, the Energy Efficiency Directive and the Buildings Directive, proposing an end to these fossil fuel subsidies by mid-decade. So this is a clear direction of travel, quite swift need to introduce very significant policies and very significantly change our investment strategies for heating. And of course, the price crisis makes it clearer than ever that remaining on fossil fuels is incredibly risky for low-income households, not least the price volatility we've seen and the security of supply considerations. But also, I think there are significant concerns now around the cost of stranded infrastructure. So as more and more households and energy users remove themselves from their gas grids, the costs of that infrastructure are going to be paid for by a smaller number of households. If those households are lower income households, then that's going to be a significant extra energy burden on them. In addition to that, there may be, and I think we are seeing real risk of the costs of hydrogen development being shared amongst all energy users, including residential, whereas actually I think it is increasingly clear that hydrogen will only benefit certain sectors and they will not be the residential sectors. So lots of cost risk in the future. And the other risk just to identify as well, I think, is if we haven't identified these affordable pathways for low-income households to switch, and we are starting to get bad outcomes whereby households can't replace their gas boilers or their other fossil fuel boilers with an affordable alternative, then I think this is going to challenge the social acceptance of the sorts of strong fossil fuel phase-out policies that we need and are starting to be introduced. So with that as the context, we started to look at, okay, so first of all, what are the economics of switching? What challenges do we need to address? And then looking around for some of the strategies to address those challenges. And in starting with the economic analysis, I must say that we hugely benefited doing this work at the time that we did it, because I think in the last couple of years, we have really benefited from quite a large number now of studies looking at what are the future most affordable clean heat options. And we really benefited as well from the fact that the studies are all concluding very, very similar things. And that is that the future most affordable clean heat solutions will be heat pumps and clean, efficient district heating. So here's just one of those studies based on analysis from Cambridge Econometrics. And you can very clearly see here the little turquoisey bars are the different types of heat pumps, coupled with solar thermal coming across as the very clearly the most affordable solutions in the decade to come. So this is 2030 to 2040. Just to highlight one or other of these studies, district heating, as we know, offers not only access to lots of alternative heat sources like waste heat, like geothermal, but also in this study for the European Consumer Association, BEUC, found that actually, of course, many technologies can deliver heat more efficiently when delivered through a district heating system as well. So district heating clearly benefits from these two things. Having said that, we focused in our study on heat pumps. We focused on heat pumps because, first of all, heat pumps, district heating won't be available to all households. Heat pumps are the sort of the individual building level solution that has been identified as most cost effective in the future. But also when we started to think about it, we really realized the economics of switching from an individual system to an individual heat pump versus switching from an individual heating system to connecting to a district heating system were entirely different. Very simply, the upfront costs for switching from, say, a gas boiler to a heat pump are quite significant, but are also borne by the individual household. Whereas actually to connect to a district heating system, the connection costs are usually much, much lower. And upfront costs are quite often, rolled into the ongoing contract for heat. So the economics are clearly very, very different. The ownership structures are also very different in district heating, and we also have very, very different questions around consumer protection and who controls and governs the system. So really, we decided it was an entirely different paper, and so this is the focus on heat pumps. So what are the economics of switching, and how affordable or unaffordable is it? We approached this question with sort of quite a simple total cost of ownership assessment. So total cost of ownership, looking at not only the upfront cost of the technology, so the heat pump or the fossil fuel boiler, but then also its running costs and a few other costs like maintenance over the lifetime of that technology. We realized, of course, with prices being as they are, so very volatile, that one assessment at one single price point, wouldn't really tell a fair story. So we decided to do assessments on two price points. One, this is presented here, pre the price crisis, and then you'll see in a moment one that is more at price crisis or current levels. We chose countries that are heavily reliant on a dominant fossil fuel source for heating, so you can see some of them here, and just another nuance, we decided to use average household energy use for heat, rather than try and look at a specific subsection of the population that are low income. But what we did to allow for that is that you can see in the hatched bar is that in the knowledge that low income households tend to underheat, they tend to ration energy, we've here illustrated the impact of underheating by around 20%. So just in the knowledge that actually what households are projected or might be spending on average is not actually what lower income households are spending. And clearly the aim with shifting to clean heat is not only to clean up the heating, but also ideally to be producing a full heat service rather than a rationed heat service. And so this is the difference shown there in the hatch section. And I don't need to spend too long describing these charts here. Before the price crisis, the story was the same pretty much for all of the countries we looked at, is that the heat pump total cost of ownership over the lifetime on the left in all the charts is more expensive, it's a higher cost than for the fossil fuel alternatives. And that, of course, as you can see, is a result of two things. The heat pump itself, the blue bars at the bottom, are more expensive, between 50% more expensive and 3 or even 4 times more expensive than the fossil fuel boiler alternatives. But also because running costs were higher, and that's clearly to do with the fact that electricity is more expensive per unit than fossil fuels in most countries, I think in all countries in Europe. And this is a really, really super important point to make. Heat pumps are very, very efficient. I think we're all quite familiar here. We used a coefficient of performance, so an efficiency of 3.1 in our study, compared to an efficiency you'd get out of a fossil fuel boiler, the best being probably 0.95 through an efficient modern gas boiler. So you can see that the heat pump is about 3 times more efficient than the fossil fuel alternative, but the running costs were still higher, which means in these countries that electricity was more than 3 times the price of the fossil fuel comparison. And that relationship between heat pump performance and the relationship between energy prices is really important, and it will come up again. So pre-price crisis, the economics of switching certainly didn't look very great. Then we did analysis at more sort of price crisis levels, and we took prices from summer last year. I think despite the fact that wholesale prices of gas have gone down a lot since then, we are still seeing in our retail prices that what we're paying in our bills today, we're still seeing prices at this level, that the height of the bars has switched. So just looking at Germany here, that clearly the economics of clean heat has got better. The heat pump bar on the left is now lower. It's more cost effective than the gas boiler in Germany now. So clearly, if you can afford it, if you are worried about ongoing volatile fossil fuel prices and you've got some money in the bank for a heat pump, you might be looking at this and saying, yeah, actually, this is the time to make the switch. However, as we know, when the prices of everything goes up, the affordability of everything goes down. And so clearly, although the economics, we're becoming clearer under these prices that the heat pump is the right option, it doesn't necessarily make it an affordable option when compared to the level of bills when energy or heat was last sort of affordable. And so we're using the 2021 spend on the gas boiler with this 20% under heating as a sort of proxy for the kind of last affordable point of heating, really just illustrative. And the green bars you can see are what we're sort of terming the affordability gap that needs to be filled now to make sure that heat is affordable. And so that's the challenge we gave ourselves in the paper, to look at what are the strategies being employed to really reduce this affordability gap. So in those strategies, we looked at two types of strategy. First of all, reducing the upfront investment costs, and I would say this is arguably probably the simpler strategy, and then looking at how to reduce and make more knowable and guaranteed and less volatile the running costs. So first of all, we looked at, which is already now well known as a accepted strategy for reducing upfront costs of subsidies, which is to provide public upfront costs of technologies, which is to provide public subsidies. And we reviewed the availability of subsidies for clean heat across the European countries. We built very heavily on a recent study by the Occo Institute in Germany, in which they performed a study of all 27 countries and the clean heating subsidies available. The good news from that study is that they found 25 of 27 countries did have clean heating subsidies, which is great news, although the authors themselves did caveat that quite heavily, saying some of these subsidy programs were what they called fig leaves. So they're kind of there in body and not really spirit. So they might be quite small budgets, or budgets only available for a relatively limited time period. So really not equal to the need in the country or the demand. What we did then, taking that survey, was to look at the suitability of those subsidy programs for access to low-income households. The first thing we did was look at the kind of generosity of the subsidy. We identified subsidy programs offering 70% of the cost of the technology or more, and those that are offering differentiated subsidy levels based on income bands, so higher subsidy for low-income households. And we found 9 countries offering these subsidies structured in this way. But then, because we know it's not only the generosity of the subject, the amount of money that you can get that it guarantees access, there are a number of other design features that are important to make sure that low-income households actually do benefit from these subsidies. We then started to also review those 9 programs for things like whether the budget is dedicated for low-income households, whether the budget is short-term or long-term, and whether there are competing subsidies for fossil fuels. We know all of these things can hinder or enable access to lower-income households. And when looking at those other design features, we actually only found one program that overcame or addressed those barriers, and that is the program in France. And I have tried to translate the many elements of support in France that can be combined together, suitable for lower income households. And they're made up of some public funding, top lines here, with other funding levels suitable and differentiated by income bracket and household size, that can be coupled with some energy supplier support, also coupled with zero interest loans and municipal support schemes. There's really quite a lot there. On the other hand, I think what I found actually just in trying to translate it myself, but also in talking to French stakeholders, is that this is a very complex system to navigate. It also changes very frequently. And so therefore, there is this big question about kind of administrative burden. How do households, particularly those that are time-strapped, really navigate their way through these systems? And I don't think this is just a criticism of the French scheme. I think we're also hearing some very similar stories out of the very generous Italian super bonus, which is offering incredibly high, 110% of costs. But we have seen that administrative burden has in part, one of the reasons that actually it's benefited higher income households more than lower income households. So in conclusion there on addressing these upfront costs, much more needs to be done to enable access to public subsidies by low-income households. And I would also argue that we need to massively reprioritise the use of public funds. We've traditionally used public funds to incentivise the take-up of technologies by people who can afford to contribute to the costs quite significantly themselves. I think we need to question that strategy, given the limited public funds we have and the huge need we have to decarbonise heating this decade. So I think there's a reprioritisation needed to focus those funds more on low-income households. Then the next strategies we looked at were, as I say, for the running costs, to reducing the running costs, and we found 5 different approaches. I would say here that I was quite disappointed in doing this research that we didn't find more. We really spread the net wide, looking at everything from kind of national level energy prices, big pricing measures, so quite structural measures, all the way through to trials and programs being undertaken by social housing providers or small energy cooperatives. But it wasn't easy to find a lot of strategies, a lot of people working on this affordable heat options. So starting with the first, going back really to that key question of the heat pump performance compared to the electricity and fossil fuel price differential. One of the reasons we see electricity as being a lot more expensive than the fossil fuel equivalents is because of policy choices. Taxes and levies are much more often placed on electricity bills than they are on gas bills, for example. And this is, I think, a really useful chart to illustrate that. It shows the burden on electricity bills in blue of taxes and levies versus that burden on gas bills in yellow. And you can very clearly see. And I would say thanks here to, credit goes here to Sam and another team from RAP and partners at 3E for this paper, which is well worth a read. So clearly there is potential to address this kind of structural issue of the difference between electricity and fossil fuel prices. And that same paper identified a number of strategies to do that. I think what's important when thinking about decarbonising heat for low-income households is which of these strategies that you use. Some of these strategies, and I think probably I would say those most often used in member states, aim to take the burden from the electricity bill and put it onto the fossil fuel bill. So providing in some way a kind of double incentive to switch. Your electricity becomes cheaper and your fossil fuel becomes more expensive. However, of course, that creates huge risks for lower income households who are stuck on fossil fuels, who are not yet enabled. And I think if we're honest, low-income households are never the first to be taking up the newer technologies. So I think we do need to think about then overburdening low-income households who are stuck on fossil fuels. A number of these strategies don't add the burden to fossil fuels, but just shift the burden away from electricity. So they're lowering the tax overall on electricity. Obviously, that results in a loss of revenue nationally. So there are always trade-offs here, or shifting the levies into the public budget, which once again is an additional strain on the public budget. But I think there are definitely design options that need to be explored if the priority is to both incentivize the switch, but also protect vulnerable customers that are still on fossil fuels. So the second strategy, I think probably the most traditional actually, is energy efficiency. I won't dwell on this for too long, but I think it's really important to point out that energy efficiency first or with clean heat can safeguard affordability. Most obviously, a more efficient home has a lower heating need. This reduces your bills, but also can reduce the size of the heat pump that you need, so therefore reducing the upfront investment costs. Very importantly, a more efficient home enables the heat pump to perform better within a kind of broader range of external temperatures. So remembering the importance of heat pump performance when compared to the difference in electricity and gas price, it's really important to preserve this heat pump performance. And then thirdly, I think the key benefit of energy efficiency, and we'll see this in one of the later strategies, is that I think a more efficient home enables us to shift our heating use to at times of day that are less expensive. And I think this is going to be a key strategy in reducing operating costs of heat pumps. And clearly, when our homes are more efficient, they hold heat longer, it allows us to turn down or turn off heating for those periods where there's very high demand. So really, I always think of the European housing stock as perhaps our kind of biggest heat and energy storage device that we, resource rather than that we will ever have, if they're insulated efficiently. A challenge I see coming is that a number of the fossil fuel boiler phase out policies in member states are not being coupled with minimum energy performance standards for homes, so minimum energy efficiency standards. So I think that could lead to higher bills than necessary and not capturing a lot of these benefits. Good news is that I think a number of countries are the ones to follow. Scotland, certainly, I think in its recently published, or in fact soon to be regulated, heat and building strategy has got a good approach. And the Dutch home insulation standard is another one that's, I think, really excellent in that it's specifically designed to ready homes to be heated efficiently with renewables. So I think that this is a key area that we need to think about energy efficiency much more hand in hand with clean heat needs. So the third strategy is another technology-based strategy, but it's looking beyond energy efficiency to multiple building level technologies. And I must say, I was quite surprised actually in seeing these examples. There are examples I saw mainly in social housing, where they're looking at perhaps more novel technology combinations. And I think the golden one, the magic combination is the air source heat pump with rooftop solar and a battery. And there's in particular a program that's just released some results run in Scotland with a social housing provider that's taken exactly this approach with these three technologies, and they are presented selective results, and I think these are the better end of the results, but clearly some incredible benefits, up to 90% of electricity supply coming directly from the PV or from the PV via the battery, clearly massively reducing your bill of energy needed from the grid. I also think this is an interesting development because I think anyone that worked in buildings and renovation knows that there's a lot of nuts still to crack in getting a lot of insulation into buildings, particularly buildings that are harder to treat, so solid wall buildings with more expensive insulation needs. There's a lot of hassle factors as well. And I do wonder whether the drastic reduction of costs in rooftop solar and the sort of relatively more plug-in and play nature of the technologies may be the reason that actually we might see a shift in focus away from insulation towards these other technologies. Whether that is a good thing or a bad thing, I don't know, but I think it's definitely a development that we should be aware of. The fourth strategy I've already touched upon a number of times, and I would recommend this paper recently published by a colleague of mine on which is around how we access the value and therefore the bill savings in offering to the grid the flexibility of our energy use, how when we move our energy use to times of the day when clean generation is more abundant and demand is lower and grid stress is lower, then we can actually really benefit from cheaper electricity. And this is something I've been really thinking and talking about for a while, actually, is that, very simply just noticing there are times in the day when electricity is almost free overnight, for example, in some tariff structures. How do we get the benefit of that really cheap or even free electricity to the people who need it most, low-income households? This is a question that I've been talking about for a while, or at least asking people about for a while, and I've had a lot of pushback. And I think it's because demand-side flexibility has had a bit of a bad rap, for many reasons. I think it's been seen as the first one here, people running around switching things on and off in response to signals, changing behaviors like ironing your clothes at night. It's been seen as households and customers serving the energy system rather than the other way round, which is, I think, completely the wrong way to look at it. And I think also it's been seen as some customers can benefit from this and other customers can't. So some customers are inflexible and others are flexible, and that's not true at all. We all have innately flexible demand. We all have innately not flexible demand. I want my tea when I want it. I want to put my television on when I want to put it on. There are some things that I'm not willing to flex. However, with automation and things like energy efficiency, we can definitely build the capacity of every customer to have flexible elements of their demand. I think one of the other reasons that demand-side flexibility has had a bad rap is that we have in the past, and we continue to use tariffs as the main way to incentivize and reward flex. And of course, tariffs that offer energy at different prices at different times in the day are innately risky for the householder. You are exposed to higher prices of electricity, and if you cannot be guaranteed, you cannot be sure that you can move that demand to a different time, then of course it's quite risky. And certainly for low-income households, I think some of those risks have not been worth bearing for the benefits. So beyond tariffs, what we looked at is some of the solutions that are developing, and I would have liked to have seen more here. I saw a lot of research projects, but not a lot of kind of more commercially available activities focused on low-income households. But what we did see is everything from sort of simple, very simple models. There's a lovely model from Energy Cloud in Ireland, who are very simply matching up surplus wind overnight, and so electricity generation that would be curtailed or wasted, and matching it up with energy storage, heat storage in the form of water tanks. And with a kind of plug-in device, they can provide free hot water overnight to social housing tenants. It's a very simple, very nice model. On the other end of the kind of complexity scale, we're seeing sort of much more complex or aggregation of demand matching with supply in a kind of much more granular and real-time way, and then even coupling behind the meter assets, so local PV from an energy cooperative, for example, with local demand, to really kind of make those local assets work as hard as possible, providing local households with as much sort of cheap local energy as possible. So there's a lot of innovation going on here, and I think it's absolutely the place for innovators to be. The final solution, or the final piece of work that we identified, was very much around services. And I really think this is key. If we reflect back on some of the previous solutions, the energy efficiency and the other air source heat pump, PV, battery technology combinations, it's all getting quite complex. So there's quite a lot of technological complexity going on. And then when you think about the interactions with the grid and demand-side flexibility, there's another layer of technology. So, we either need suddenly entire populations of very, very well-informed people with a lot of time on their hands, or we need some services to fill the gap and overcome some of that complexity. These services can take all sorts of forms, aggregators, one-stop shops, but the focus that we put was on the service of heat as a service. So I'm sure people are familiar with heat as a service, but in general, the service provider provides the technology, invests in the technology, whether that be a heat pump or a combination of heat pump and energy efficiency and automation, building controls, and then offers a heat service contract to the householder in which heat is provided within guaranteed comfort guidelines or parameters for a fixed monthly fee. And I have seen in a couple of places heat as a service being tried at least to benefit lower income households. And I think it does, as a concept, hold a lot of potential here. You know, it's a service and a sort of economic model in which we can integrate both subsidies available nationally for the technologies, but also integrate subsidies we might be getting on our bills as well, so winter fuel payments or other heating payments, sort of into a much more efficient package. It can overcome the bureaucratic barriers in accessing to subsidies, overcome some of the complexity of the technology mixes and the interaction with electricity systems. As I've said, you know, reduces unexpected costs of maintenance and service, which we know are, these unexpected costs are the ones that lower income households find the least able to bear. And I also think, very importantly, the service provider takes on responsibility and internalizes actually the importance of the performance of the energy system, or the heating system rather. And once again, the performance of heat pumps is absolutely key. So I've spoken a lot and I've cantered through some of the solutions we've found. I'm very much hoping that there are other solutions out there that people listening today might be able to either raise questions about or hopefully give examples. This slide is just really summarizing some of the things that from these solutions alone we try to conclude. The key point, I think, is there's a lot that has to happen this decade. A real refocusing of public funds, I think, cognizant of the compromises that means. If we're refocusing public funds on heating and energy efficiency and other technologies for low-income households, we are compromising other uses and other outcomes like cheap energy savings nationally, or cheap carbon savings nationally, that might be achieved with the more traditional incentive programs. I think we need to focus much more on these optimal combinations of energy efficiency with other technologies. Rebalancing energy prices, of course, we've covered that. And then these last 3 bullet points, I think, maybe are the areas where we need the most attention. And these are really around the kind of new services and offerings, taking the risk out of flexibility through automation, aggregation and services, and then developing heat as a service and other offerings that are suitable for all household types and respond to the needs of all household types. And, you know, I think a one size fits all doesn't fit in this context. And really, I think that leads us to much more need for the kind of inclusive innovation, where we don't start innovation with the needs of the early adopters, but we start with a focus on the needs of those who have more complex needs, but also who are at greater risk from not decarbonising. So there are further resources that I'll share, and that's all I'll say. I'm really looking forward to the questions.